April 9th is known as a Day of Valor in the Philippines. It is a significant day of national observance, commemorating the fall of Bataan to the invading Japanese army during World War II. This tragic event remains as the largest surrender of American forces in U.S. history. It also marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing cruelties of the war, which later would become known as the Bataan Death March. On April 9, 1942, after months of relentless battle, United States Army General Edward P. King, Jr. made a painful decision that would forever solidify the tragedy of Bataan Philippines among the worst atrocities of World War II.
General King said that he had come to secure terms for the force in Bataan.
The surrender of Bataan was not just a military defeat, but a sacrifice meant to save thousands of lives. On the island fortress of Corregidor, U.S. General Jonathon Wainwright was in command of all U.S. forces in the Philippines. He was promoted to this position after the departure of General Douglas MacArthur. General Wainwright now had his own painful decision to make about the fate of the men under his command. This is a story of the greatest surrender in U.S. history.
So one might ask, is there still a need for heroes?
Duty, honor, country. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying points to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope becomes forlorn. That in war there is no substitute for victory. That if you lose, the nation will be destroyed. That the very obsession of your public service must be duty, honor, country.
In December of 1941, just hours after the attack of Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan launched a full-scale invasion of the Philippines. Being outnumbered and outgunned, General MacArthur orders the retreat of American and Filipino forces to the rugged Bataan Peninsula, where they dug in for a bloody and brutal last stand. As the situation in Bataan worsened, General MacArthur remained on the island of Corregidor, directing the defense against the advancing Japanese. President Franklin Roosevelt and the U.S. War Department realized that MacArthur's capture would be an incredibly devastating blow to the American war effort and morale. On March 11, 1942, PT Boat 41 slipped out of Corregidor under the cover of darkness, bound for the island of Mindanao, before flying to Australia, leaving behind the men who would later surrender. President Roosevelt's orders were not well received by General MacArthur. He saw the defense of the Philippines as his own personal responsibility. He knew that abandoning the forces in the Philippines would be seen as a betrayal, but the president made it clear that his leadership was needed elsewhere. 4 days later, the general and his party arrived by B-17 Flying Fortress in Australia. On March 20th, 1942, MacArthur makes a declaration that will become a significant moment in the war effort.
2 years ago, when I landed on your soil, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
Overseeing Japanese forces in Bataan was General Masura Hama, commander of Japan's 14th Army. General Hama had greatly underestimated the resilience of the Filipinos and Americans. His campaign, initially expected to last weeks, had dragged on for months. He was under increasing pressure to take control of Bataan. By April 1942, Bataan's defenders were at a breaking point. They had fought heroically for 3 months, but supplies were now gone. They suffered from hunger and illness, while overwhelming Japanese forces were heavily supplied. Knowing that further resistance would lead to the certain death of his men, General Edward King makes a consequential choice. Believing that his surrender would surely lead to his own court-martial, he decides to surrender all forces under his command in the province of Bataan. This was in direct conflict with his orders from higher command, General MacArthur and General Wainwright, to hold out at all cost. On the evening of April 8th, General King gathers his senior officers to inform him of his decision. He believes surrender is the only way to save the lives of his men. His officers, exhausted and desperate, reluctantly agree. The following morning, General King presents himself to the Japanese 14th Army. This morning we're here in Lamau, a barangay in Limay, and this is actually the place where General King first offered his surrender to the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese were not happy to learn that General King was only surrendering the Bataan forces and not the whole of U.S. forces throughout the Philippines, which remained under the command of General Wainwright. They demanded Wainwright's surrender instead. So I'm here at the Balanga Elementary School here in Talisay, Balanga. General King and his surrender party were taken to Talisay Elementary School in Balanga, Bataan, which was the headquarters of General Hama. This is where the terms of the surrender were negotiated. Japanese Colonel Nakayama represented General Hama at this meeting. General King and his surrender party were kept as hostages at the school until all troops were turned over to the Japanese. There remains some confusion and lack of information about where the actual surrender took place. It is understood that General King presented himself to the Japanese, handed over his pistol, and offered his surrender in Lamau. A plaque stands next to the barangay hall and was erected by the men who served under him and the people of Lamao. Nonetheless, both sides were very significant in the surrender of Bataan. General King felt he had no other choice but to make the decision to surrender. He disobeyed General Wainwright and General MacArthur's directives to hold out at all cost. He believed had he fought to the last man, the Japanese surely would have slaughtered every remaining man. He chose surrender in an effort to save lives, but instead left his men at the mercy of the Japanese army, who demanded an unconditional surrender. General King offered the Japanese vehicles and fuel which he had secured for the transportation of the prisoners. However, these provisions were never used for that purpose. The surrender of Bataan remains today the largest number of U.S. troops ever surrendered and began one of the most controversial atrocities of World War II, the Bataan Death March. About 78,000 American and Filipino prisoners were mistreated, beaten, and killed at the hands of their Japanese captors as they were forced to march for 6 days over 100 kilometers. Many monuments and memorials have been erected in memory of all those who so tragically and senselessly lost their lives. With the surrender of Bataan, General Wainwright knew that he was now in an incredibly dire situation. After months of relentless aerial bombardment and artillery shelling, the defense of Corregidor now appeared hopeless. On May 5th, Japanese forces landed at Corregidor for their final assault. The American and Filipino forces put up a fierce resistance, and the Japanese suffered heavy losses. It was the following morning, when Japanese tanks began to arrive on the island, that General Wainwright knew the fate of Corregidor had already been sealed. On May 6, 10:30 a.m., Wainwright ordered a surrender message to be broadcast to General Hama.
This is Lieutenant General J.M. Wainwright. After leaving General Hama with no agreement between us, I decided to accept, in the name of humanity, his proposal, and tendered at midnight, 6-7 May 1942, to the senior Japanese officer on Corregidor, the formal surrender of all American and Philippine Army troops in the Philippine Islands. You will therefore be guided accordingly.
The fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942 marked the final chapter in the Battle of the Philippines during World War II. Corregidor was the last stronghold of American and Filipino forces resisting the Japanese invasion, and signified complete occupation of the Philippines by Japan. When General MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines, he left General Wainwright in command with clear orders to resist as long as possible. When Bataan fell, MacArthur was devastated, but it was Wainwright's surrender at Corregidor that infuriated him the most. MacArthur saw Wainwright's surrender as an embarrassment. He wanted the Philippines' resistance to continue at all cost. While he acknowledged that King had acted under extreme circumstances, he never forgave Wainwright for surrendering all remaining forces in the Philippines. Though MacArthur held both Wainwright and King in low regard after their surrenders, their fates would take very different paths after the war. General Edward King spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He spent 3.5 years in various Japanese prison camps where he endured abuse, starvation, and torture. By the war's end in August of 1945, nearly half the men surrendered on Bataan had perished in captivity. General King was not hailed as a hero upon liberation. Instead, he returned to the United States in near obscurity. King was never officially reprimanded, but he was also never honored. He worked as a civilian in the Veterans Administration. He retired quietly, spending his remaining years in Georgia. He lived on a modest pension and rarely spoke about the war. He passed away in 1958 at the age of 74, largely forgotten by the military and the public. General King made the most difficult decision not to sacrifice the lives of his men for no foreseeable military gain. Yet history never gave him the recognition that he rightly deserves. General King was not invited by General MacArthur to be present for the Japanese surrender in 1945. General Jonathon Wainwright was released from a POW camp in Manchuria in 1945. General Wainwright endured years of brutal captivity, suffering from malnutrition and disease. Unlike General King, Wainwright was invited by General MacArthur to attend the full surrender of the Empire of Japan aboard the USS Missouri.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always.
In 1945, when he returned to the United States, he was surprised to find a hero's welcome. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman. He later served as commander of the Fourth Army before retiring in 1947. He became a sought-after speaker and stood as a symbol of American heroism and perseverance. He died in 1953, exactly 8 years to the day of Japan's surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. General Wainwright was buried with full honors in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Wainwright's final years as a celebrated war hero were a stark contrast to Edward King, who faded quietly into history.
But this is not only my beloved wife, but my best soldier.
General MacArthur took command of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific and would eventually lead the campaign to retake the Philippines in 1944.
General MacArthur speaking. People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two people.
After the war, he took over the administration for the occupation of Japan. MacArthur eventually returned to the United States and received a hero's welcome. He was named superintendent of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he holds the third highest score at graduation in the school's history. Douglas MacArthur, along with his father Arthur, became the first of only two father and son pair to receive the Medal of Honor. Later in life, he lived in seclusion in New York City, and on April 5, 1964, General MacArthur died at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was 84 years old, and he is buried at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor was not a failure of courage, but a story of ultimate sacrifice. General King, General Wainwright, and General MacArthur will forever have a place in American and Philippine history. Those three resounding words, spoken by General MacArthur during his famous West Point speech, never rang more true than they do in regards to the sacrifices of the Bataan forces.
Duty, honor, country.